it does not matter. If you have a bad day, the world doesn't care. If you get a bad grade, the world doesn't care. If somebody trips you up and you fall, you should have had better balance, right? Like that was why you should have had better balance? Because the world doesn't care.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Do You Know Black Creators Kickback. I'm Alyssa.
And I'm Darnell, and we're the creators and executive producers of the Do You Know Black game show and the Do You Know Black Kickback.
In the last episode of the Do You Know Black Kickback, the contestants were asked about a time a family member, loved one, or parental figure talked to them about race. So with that, I'm gonna toss it to you, Darnell, to get your experience. When was the first time that you remember being talked to about race?
Yeah, so it's actually really clearly defined for me. My mother talked to me about race 2 times in my entire life. So the first time was when I was going into 6th grade. So a little bit of a background, the town that, obviously we grew up in the same town, suburb in New York. And there were 2 different middle schools that were going into one high school. And there was a 3rd middle school that was being built. So historically, one of those middle schools was in a heavily black and brown neighborhood, and then the other one was like just straight white people, like in that school, in that district. So when they brought up, when the 3rd school was being built, all of the school district lines were being blurred, right? So it got to the point where instead of going to the school that was closest to you, you were going to a designated school. The purpose was for like integration. So by the time you got to high school, like there would be better relationships, better cultural exposure, etc. So, for example, the apartment complex that I lived in, like on our block, we had 3 different we had 3 different bus stops on our block going to 3 different schools. So me, instead of going to the school that was 1 mile away, I went to a school that was 4 miles away. And that was the school that was historically white. So there's a lot that happened behind the scenes. I'm sure PTA meetings, school board meetings that I knew nothing about. My mother, she would always drop me off to school on the first day. And going into 6th grade, new school, going right into middle school, I was about to get out of the car. And right when I was about to get out of the car, she said, "Darnell, these people are racist. Be careful." That was like all she said. She's like, "Get out." Right? So that's kind of like a scary thing to tell a 6th grader, like just to go out into your first day of school, as if going into a new school isn't scary enough. So that's the first time that she spoke to me about race. And I'll talk to you in depth about that experience soon. The second time was when I was 22, 23, and I was getting my first car. And I knew the car that I wanted. I ended up getting a Honda Accord, which I still have to this day. But I ended up getting the Honda Accord, and it was my first car. I had saved up a bunch of cash so I could buy it straight cash. And I remember I got the leather seats, like fully loaded Honda Accord. And I was talking to my mom. I was like, "Yo, I want to get black tints. That would be really dope." And then my mom looked at me and she was like, "Darnell, black car, black man, black tints, don't do it." And that's just how my mother spoke, right? Like she was very direct about what she was trying to say and what she wanted me to get out of it. But I think she also was able to speak about race and situations in that way because she knew how she raised me. So going back to the other example, when I was leaving the car and she was like, "Darnell, these people are racist, be careful." The emphasis for her wasn't on "these people are racist." The emphasis for her was "be careful," AKA, you know how I raised you, you know how I told you to act, do that. So it wasn't until now or in my adulthood when I started to think back to all of the things that she tried to instill in me over the course of time in terms of like, how do I act in public? How do I act when I speak to people? How do I talk to people? Just how culturally and situationally aware am I? And by the time it was a time to talk about race, she didn't have to necessarily have a talk about what it meant to face racism, her entire thing was like, all you can control is what you can control, which is how you act and be careful. So that was something that I always took on, and really for her, it was a no excuse environment. So it wasn't saying that like she's very well aware of racism in America and that it exists. But for her, her entire thing for me was, in any situation, was no excuses. You can't control what anybody else does, but you can control what you do. And I am always going to hold you 150% accountable for what you do, how you act, and how you present. And you will never get an opportunity to make an excuse with me. And that was just the energy that she always brought. So those were the only 2 times in my life that my mother ever talked to me about race.
It's interesting because if I had that conversation with my mom ever, I don't remember. I don't believe that we ever explicitly had a conversation about race, but I do remember the specific moments when I realized that we were obviously different. So we talk about the idea of where we grew up. We're from the same area, but we weren't from the same town, right? So I was from that town you referenced where it was all black and brown, right? And so I remember that period too, because we were around the same time it was happening with the zoning and going. You went to the mixed school. I stayed in the area. I could literally walk to my middle school. I was used to having people who looked like me in my school, and at the time, there were still white people kind of mixed in. It was getting less and less at that point, but there still were some white people that went to our school, to my middle school. But I remember when I realized there was a connotation that came with it when people started to ask us, like, where are you from? Like, once we got to high school, now at this point, it's a mix of all of the different schools in this one high school, people I had never met before that went to different middle schools, elementary schools, all of that. And people would say, where are you from? And then I would say my town. And they were just kind of like, there was just this perception about this area because it was so heavily black and brown. I feel like there was a stigma about like, oh, that's like the ghetto. Like, I feel like I started to notice that there was a distinction, like that there was a connotation with the fact that I was black. And I think added to that was the fact that while my mother never spoke to us explicitly about race, I feel like she was very much the type, and they talk about this in the episode, where, a lot of the first generation or the ones who came from immigrant families, they were talking about how their parents sort of policed them and what they did and tried to kind of separate them from, the perception of Black Americans coming here. My mom was never that explicit, but I knew that she wanted to make sure that we carried ourselves a certain way. And I feel like my mom carried herself a certain way. So we sort of self-policed ourselves, and, she sort of policed who we could hang out with and, what we were wearing. And she always taught us to present ourselves a certain way. She taught us how to communicate. My mom's an educator, so regardless, we would have spoken in this way. But I feel like it was a bit of a privilege, but also a curse, which I think we'll touch on a little bit later. But me speaking this way, just as in a normal conversation, and having people tell me, oh, you're very literate, or, oh, you're so articulate, and things like that. And the fact that me speaking normally to you, like the fact that you're gonna tell me that I'm so articulate because I'm speaking in a normal way, or other Black kids telling me that I'm speaking white because I'm speaking in a normal way, I feel like that's when it became really present to me that there was certain expectations for being Black, or certain ideas and perceptions of what it meant to be Black. And it kind of put me in a position where I didn't really feel like we fit in necessarily with the kids that we grew up with, because they ostracized us in a way for the way that we presented ourselves and carried ourselves. And at the same time, I felt like it made me feel less Black also to white people who considered us exceptions as opposed to a standard, because I knew we weren't the only ones who were like this. So it was always really a confusing conversation for me, an experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there's a certain pressure that comes with being Black, and for my mother, the way that she always was and is till to this day, she's very strategic and intentional, and she gave me all the love that a son could ever want from anybody, right? So there's that. But at the same time, she was very much so the energy that she instilled in me was nobody cares, right? Like, it does not matter. If you have a bad day, the world doesn't care. If you get a bad grade, the world doesn't care. If somebody trips you up and you fall, you should have had better balance, right? Like, that was why you should have had better balance, because the world doesn't care. Like, and she never said it in that way, because she was always very caring, but her standard was always do the best you can and then do more, because the world doesn't care. Like, if your best is not good enough, the world doesn't care if it's not good enough. All they're gonna see is that it's not good enough. So I remember and it wasn't like I was the best student. For her, it wasn't that she expected perfection from me, but she expected no excuses from me. So and I kind of knew that, right? So even when it came to grades, and we'll loop this back to when we're talking about this situation, but even when it came to grades, if I got like a 90 on something and I would bring her home a 90, she would be like, what happened to the other 10 points? Right? And I was a student athlete, right? So in her, and I know that she was kind of joking, and we joke about it to this day, and she's still like, I'm still waiting for those other 10 points. That's how she'll like say to me. But her entire thing is, okay, like she understood that 90 is good enough, but in her mind, she's like, you shouldn't want 90 to be good enough for you. Like, even if it does, but you should understand that in this world, if you leave any room for error, any room for a mistake, any slip up, then it's on you, because you didn't control what you can control to the best of your ability. And she also had this awareness that she can't control what the other people do, like in this moment. So it was like this sense of protection that she did have, and we're going to talk about that too, because Elijah spoke about that in the show. But so that's kind of the energy that she always brought to me. So it was actually, when she actually mentioned that to me, and I think back to it, it was almost like that was the first time that her, as a single mother, and I say single mother because as we've mentioned before, I was raised by my mother and my aunt in my formative years, but as a single mother that raised a son that did not have a man in the house, this was the first time that, because we're Haitian, well, I'm more in touch with the Haitian side, but well, no, right, I am, like, I grew up in the Haitian household through and through, and in growing up in church, I was surrounded by Haitians. In my community, I was surrounded by Haitians. So it was always this, even though I was exposed to other cultures, for the most part, I had a very Haitian experience, Haitian and Black experience. This was the first time that everything that she did as a parent was going to be put to the test, throwing me into this extremely volatile environment that I'm sure the administrators, other parents from that school, basically talking about desegregation, I'm sure there were so much talk that made her petrified. And the only word that she could muster is, Darnell, these people are racist. Be careful. And when I was like, in my mind, I got out of the car. It didn't really rattle me. In my mind, I'm like, say no more. Be careful, AKA means be perfect. And that's a lot of pressure. And I don't know what it's done to me today. Maybe it's kind of the reason why I can be obsessive about things now. But that's kind of what I got out of it. But I do think about, at the time my mother had me when she was young-ish. My mother had me when she was 19. So I don't know. She was it's crazy. She was younger. I think she was younger than me, like now, right? So I'm older than my mom was when she had that conversation with me, when I think about it, and how scared she must have been to send me into that environment. We'll talk about the environment, because the environment was actually really, really healthy environment, but we'll talk about it after. But that was something that I always think about.
I think it's interesting because my mom also had me young, and I'm one of two, I'm a twin. And I think our experience was different in the sense that I do believe that it's easier for girls, and it's easier, even though we didn't have that formal conversation, I definitely feel like we were able to pick up on what she was dropping. They talk about how Black boys, especially, you go through, just boys in general, are very, as kids, they're really kind of like finicky. They're like, what's the word that you would say? They're restless. But all of those things that you experience as you're kind of coming into your own, but going through puberty, like you're just, for other people outside of our race, like they handle that differently. When they talk about the idea of like teachers not knowing what to do with the boy, sending them to the principal's office, all these other experiences they have. I think my mom kind of got lucky with us because we were always pretty good kids. I mean, I'd like to say, I don't think we gave her too much trouble, but at the same time, we picked up a lot on what she did. And I think that when you talk about the idea of like carrying on some of those traits and wondering what it did to you as an adult, like I feel like now I see some of those things and I wish I could change it a little bit more. But like my mom was very hyper aware of other people, and like she always tried, she was a people pleaser. She is a people pleaser, and in the best way. But at the same time, I think she was also very hyper aware of how we were being perceived. And so it was always, if you laughed too loud, it was like, don't cause a scene. Don't be that Black person that's like too loud in the back of the theater. Don't be that way. And I think that it kind of, that policing in a sense also carries over to us now. And now you laugh because I'm the same way with you, where I get very sensitive to like the stereotypes. Like I don't want to be that one out there. Like I can't just go out in a hair bonnet or like a headscarf, go outside. Like I can't be that person. So I have to take the extra time. Damn, I gotta do my hair just to go down the street and come back. Yes, I do. In a way, I did internalize that, like the fact that I had to be hyper aware of how I was presenting to people. And I think it's interesting, and I don't want to divert the conversation, but like when they were talking about the differences between the immigrant parents and being here and their perception in another country, their perception of Black Americans was what they saw on television, right? And I think that it's true. And I remember in college having a conversation with this guy that was in my class, and he was Nigerian, and we were having like this whole conversation. I don't even know how it got onto race, but he had made a comment, and he was talking about, my family, like we see, like all they see, or they did see when they were back in Nigeria, was like the women on TV were like, the Black American women were loud and like ghetto, or that's literally how he said it. Like ratchet, that was the word that he used, ratchet. And he's like, but not you though. You're good. Like I was some sort of exception. And I feel like that kind of plays into just even the division between Americans and Black Americans and policing who's acceptable in society. I mean, think about it. There is still that perception, I think, today where, maybe African born, either African born, not even Americans, but like people in America are perceived better or more accepted than the Black Americans here because of those same reasons. It's just, I found it interesting that we've kind of also divided ourselves in that way, and
I think in society in general, well, first and foremost, the reason I was actually laughing was because you were talking about how like you were raised to be like really quiet in the movie theater, but I was thinking about that time that you like screamed really loud in the movie when what movie was it again? Oh my
I'm not
goodness.
don't say it out loud. I'm embarrassed.
I don't remember the movie, but it was not that serious.
It was just a jumpy scene. It wasn't that it was scary. It was that scene, The Perfect Guy with Michael Ealy and Sonali Lathan and Morris Chestnut. It was a random jump I wasn't expecting. I didn't say it was like a scary, it was just random.
I think he was under the bed and you screamed so loud. I was like, what is wrong with you? But you should have learned what your mom tried to teach you in that moment, because you screamed hella loud for no reason. Everybody in the whole theater was like, what? What was that? But that's why I was smiling. So, because that was some kind of moment. I think he was under the bed. But in any event, jokes aside, I think that, before even getting into that, I think it goes back to like, because one of the things that Penny spoke about, Jeff spoke about, Harana spoke about as well, was talking about how their parents as immigrants had this, like you just said, had this perception of Black Americans, and they associated certain traits with Black Americans. So Jeff spoke about like, hey, the do-rag being associated to the Black American, and they kind of, joked about that a little bit, right? Saying like, oh, if you're wearing a do-rag, like that means that you're a drug dealer. And then that's kind of like the perception that they had there, right? So there were like a lot of these different things that are like in the first generation when you talk about immigrants, because they are seeing those things on the news. So we'll talk about that for a little bit, and then we'll talk about what Elijah spoke about, which is how this is globally how people are perceiving Black Americans, and from a white perspective, how they're perceiving Black Americans. Because I do think that a heavy part of this is not just a happenstance of the media. I think it's very strategic how the media historically has marketed and monetized Black people and Black culture in a way that they can get money without actually helping the Black community. In fact, a lot of times damaging the Black community, damaging the credibility of the Black community, and damaging the perception of the Black community. So we'll get into that conversation. But like from my personal experience, my mother is interesting because my mother's big thing was, don't think about anybody else. Like if there was a quote that would apply to my mother, that even though she never said this, but if there was a quote that you would think she would say, it's like, if everybody else jumped off a bridge, would you too? Like that's the embodiment of who my mother is. My mother does not care about anybody else. Like, what are you doing? So when she was telling me certain things, whether it's talking about how to dress, don't, I think all Black boys at some point were told about like, oh, your pants are sagging, lift your pants up, put a belt on, right? How your hair looks, right? How are you talking? Whatever it may be, mind your manners, mind how you look, all these things in public. She never associated do-rag with Black people. She never associated sagging pants with other Black people. She always just associated with this, for whatever reason, is something that if you go out in public, you individually are going to be perceived in a negative way. So you control how you're perceived outside. So she never spoke about racism. She never said, oh, well, white people this or white people that, or this is gonna happen, because I think part of it was like, she would think that if she told me about racism, I think she was afraid that she would plant the opportunity for me to think that I could have an excuse for not being perfect, right? I think that was kind of where it was. Or on the flip side, if she were to associate dressing a certain way with don't dress that way because Black people, whatever, and it was outside, it would be like she's giving me an excuse to try to compare myself to other people. And she's like, it doesn't matter what other people are doing, it's what you're doing. So this is just like the energy that she always brought, which is interesting because it's a little bit different than what Penny and Harana and Jeff said, where it sounded like their parents were a lot more intentional with associating that. I have some other thoughts on that topic, but I want to stop and give you an opportunity to chime in there.
No, I mean, I don't disagree with what you're saying. I think that it's just, we're in an interesting place as just Black people, because there shouldn't be any reason why You could be perfectly capable of doing exactly the same thing. We've had these conversations with others offline where we talk about the fact that sometimes, the smartest person in the room could be the dude in the do-rag, but like, we understand that not everybody has the freedom to be accepted in the space. We've also had this conversation with people you've worked with before, right? About like how they dress in corporate, and should they be able to wear the same thing that their white peers are wearing? Absolutely. This, a white dude could come in with a throwback jersey if he wanted to one day, and he would be completely accepted. But there's just no space in there for us, regardless of what we want and what should be fair. Like, we don't have that luxury. And I think that, again, Black people need to. Some of us understand this, and I know other people are trying to change this, but I don't think that we're in a space yet where we're free to do what we want because white people are also doing it. We just have to live with the fact that we don't have those same luxuries.